Hey everybody, I'm Bob Bakert with Jazz Guitar today, and we're trying to make this be impromptu, even though we've been setting it up for about a half an hour. So we'll go from there. What a wonderful surprise and honor it is for me to be called and asked to be a part of this really celebration of John Pisano. I mean, I can't tell you there's so much you could talk about when you talk about John. I mean, I'm like I'm almost speechless with this. I really am, and I'm not being a phony about it. John played with so many people. I mean, the list of people that he recorded with. Let me give you this for just a second. For people that don't know, there's a lot of information about him, of course, on the website. But everybody from Ryan Adams, Gato Barbieri, Tony Bennett, Lenny Breau, Michael Bublé, Frank Camp, Roy Clark, Natalie Cole, Sam Cooke. I keep going down the line here. Dan Hicks, Paul Horn, Diana Krall. Are any of these names familiar to y'all? Barry Manilow, Howard Roberts, Kenny Rogers. I mean, this list is just huge. And not to say that he didn't also tour and record with Herb Alpert, Peggy Lee, Sergio Mendes, and of course, Joe Pass. Um, he had an amazing career, of course, as a professional musician. But the other thing that he did, which is kind of what we want to talk about more today, is what he did for jazz guitar by having the guitar night, the John Pisano guitar night for all those years. And if you're not familiar with the John Pisano guitar night, please go onto YouTube and watch because there's a million YouTubes of John playing. And John's playing was pretty incredible. I mean, he reminds me almost of an organ player. His chords and his rhythm, and he did a whole lot of, ands and ins, and it was just tremendous, tremendous playing. And he organized this thing, and I'm going to let people that know more about the specifics of it talk about it. But I got to know him when I was director over at Eastman Guitars, and I was there for a couple of years after I retired. And John, of course, has an Eastman guitar, and got to know him, and we talked an awful lot. He invited me out for pizza. I never made it. I regret that, but I wish I could have made it. Always had great conversations with him. When you got on the phone with John, it was an hour. You just count on it. I mean, he was just that kind of guy. I mean, he was your uncle, even though he wasn't your uncle. I mean, he was your uncle. Um, and so we're being joined today by his lovely bride, Jeanne Pisano. I'm gonna wave at him, Jeanne. Thank you. John Storie, and most of you know who John is. And of course, the lovely lady with the blonde hair, Beth Marlis, who doesn't really need a whole lot of introduction. She's been a staple on the West Coast guitar scene for forever and ever and ever, and at Guitar Institute, and taught thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and so it's an honor to be here. What I want to do is I want to turn this over to Beth and kind of describe what you'd like us to know about John.
Well, first, Bob, thank you for doing this. It's really our honor to be here and share this with you, and to contribute just one little bit more to John's legacy and his memory. And it's a lot going on today, and today is very auspicious in a lot of ways, as we'll get to. But I will share what I can and my experience of John, which probably of the three of us is the least, believe it or not. That made them laugh, but it's probably true. You talked about regretting not getting the pizza with John. Well, I don't have a lot of regrets in life. That's sort of not how I roll, but I have one, and that is, for years, John would ask me to come play at guitar night, and I always politely refused. Oh, I'm too busy. Da 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 da. I never did it, and
Oh boy,
yeah, I regret that
yeah, I
because
can see why.
you can.
Yeah, I hate to, rarely do I ever pile on, Beth, but I get it.
Yeah,
I
so
really do.
I'm happy though that, through all the people that got to be a part of it, it lives on in them and they're playing and all the glowing kind of honestly the love that they have for John and for that particular world and community he created on top of an absolutely stellar career is just second to none. So my part of this, my experience of John in person was a memory you mentioned GIT, where I've been there since several 100 years now, and uh, john John used to come into the school, not unaccompanied though. He would come with Joe Pass, come to GIT in the 80s, and they would sit in a room and play together. It was called open counseling. It's like office hours. Drop in. Anybody could come in and play with Joe Pass, but not really, because Joe wouldn't let anybody comp for him except John Pisano. So John, so all of us, and this goes back to my day of being a student in 1985. I remember going in the room and, oh, I get to play with Joe Pass. It was exciting and terrifying. But really, it was equally incredible to hear John playing together with the perfect accompaniment, the perfect moment, and who Joe would trust. Joe wouldn't trust any old GIT student or even faculty member to comp for him. And that speaks volumes, I think, to the quality of John's playing and the rapport that those two shared. I did actually play with. I'll just throw in a quick one about Joe Pass. I did play with him, and one of my great lessons in playing with Joe Pass at that point in my life. I can tell you another story about when I was younger. I took a lesson from him, but in my 20s, I played in this open counseling with Joe, and we were playing a blues, and he stopped me right in the middle of the solo, and he said, "Why'd you play that B flat? Tell me, what are you doing there? Stop! Why'd you play that B flat?" I was mortified. Mortified. I couldn't explain it. I mean, I don't know, not very good. I don't know. But the lesson, sort of subtext of it all was that if you can't explain or vouch for everything you play, then you're not going to be a professional. If you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, where it is in the flow, or leading to somewhere, then get out of the room. That's kind of what he was telling me. It was a little harsh lesson, but I'll have to say to this day I never forgot it. And again, I loved. It was like really a sort of spiritual thing to go into that room and have John and Joe there playing, almost every week for a while. So
Wow.
that's my experience. It's embedded in my DNA in a very deep way. And I know the two people next to me have very deep experience with who John was, continues to be, how he lives on. And I might pass the baton to Jeanne Pisano, because who knows more than Jeanne, if you feel like you'd like to start anywhere and talk about John.
I'm not sure what. Thank you, Beth. That was interesting.
Yeah, thanks, Beth.
It's embarrassing. It's like,
That's great.
Not at all. Not at
I
all.
love that story.
You were a kid. You learned.
That's great. Different time.
Wonder.
Yeah.
And I too want to echo Beth. Thank you so much, Bob, for doing this. It's lovely to for you to honor John this way, and I appreciate it deeply. Thank you.
I'm truly honored. And I mean that sincerely. And I mean, before Beth, you said second to none when you talk about a career, and so often that phrase is tossed out, and you go, but truly, John's career as a jazz guitarist was second to none. Anyway, Jeanne, I'm sorry I interrupted you. So please.
Not at all. No, he had a remarkable life, and as his wife, I stood in awe of all that he had accomplished, and always considered it a privilege that we were able to work together musically as the Flying Pisanos. I always took it as an honor and a privilege, because he was just no one accompanied or arranged for vocal and guitar the way he did. I was re-listening to a CD we did back in 2000. Not only was his playing magnificent, but the subtleties and the amazing, we didn't arrange, but he always had structure and he knew what he wanted to do. And he did it, and he did it. He was an absolute master. Just phenomenal. Just, I continue to be in awe of his mastery of so many different aspects of music, and not to mention his love of the instrument itself, the guitar. I mean, as you know, he created the John Pisano model for Eastman with his friend Ted Mayer, who couldn't be here with us today because of a severe back problem. But um, he loved the instrument, and he never stopped tweaking it and wanting it to be better and better. John, in his own way, was a perfectionist. He was very detail oriented. And this was
I'm laughing because yes, he was. I had to deal with him on that guitar, and it was like, I don't want that red wire to be red. I think I like it blue. I mean, it was like crazy. I mean, in a good way. It was always to improve, always to improve, always to improve. Please.
absolutely. He put you guys at Eastman through their paces. I know that.
Oh, I loved him. I loved his calls. I loved talking to him. You mentioned about arranging for voice. I studied voice in college as an opera major, as a classical major for a while, and I also studied jazz guitar. And I'm not going to say I was any good at either one of those two, but I did try real hard. And I can tell you this, that try, a guitar player accompanying a vocalist is extremely difficult to do
Yes, it is.
because they sit in the same bandwidth. And staying out of as you're as a singer, you can appreciate that. I mean, I know you can. And so when you say that, I want people to understand that you just don't play the chords and accompany a vocalist. You really got to come up with voicings that give the singer space to move and allow their timbre to be fully realized, and the guitar can just take it right out of it. And so that's a huge skill to have.
It's an
So
art.
yeah, it is. It truly is an art, and obviously Joe Pass did it really well. Um, but there's a lot of guitar players out there that really that's they're good at a whole lot of things, but that's just not one of them. And to be good at it is you have to have a real ear and understand timbre and bandwidth and all those things.
No, I was talking about, that he was detail oriented, and Joe, the complete master that he was of the guitar and solo playing as no one does, and talk about, or ever did, and talk about arranging on the spot. But when they worked together and recorded together, John was the one that always pulled everything together, because Joe was just, oh, let's just go do it.
Right.
Because that's Joe. And it worked for Joe. But John knew you had to have a little bit of structure. And the joke that they had, Joe wrote something to John one time saying how he was his favorite guitarist to work with, and he said, "Thanks for putting up with all my BS, and I promise one day I'll rehearse."
No, he's not. Oh,
Happened, but
That's funny.
that's neither here nor there. They managed to accomplish quite a body of work together. But John loved Joe like no other that I had known in the guitar world. He worshipped him, and
oh,
was stated when he passed. But his John took great pride in the fact that Joe thought so much of him that he would write those things and would say those things to him, and genuinely meant it. It was he was immensely proud of that,
well,
and felt like he lost a part of himself when Joe died.
yeah, I can see that for sure. There's an Italian kinship going on there, that transcends pizza and lasagna. So it's a big deal. It really is a
Don't like
big deal.
John's red sauce because he never put onions in it.
I was gonna.
That was important to Joe. I gotta tell you.
I'm sorry I didn't hear that.
That was important to Joe Pass.
To do what? To do what?
No
You-
onions, no onions in the marinara. Now, I think it's
No.
sitting at might be the site of many meals
Oh,
where
there were
Joe
many.
Pass and John and you
Joe sat right
at
there.
this table.
Right
yeah,
there
had
next
dinners
to
and-
you, Beth. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And Ellen was at the end of the table, his wife. Yes. And there were many, and Frank Potenza was here with Joe and John and Ellen and me. We've had many, many meals. And John would cook for Joe. I mean, he, and that's why, and Joe would always say something about the way the parsley had to be cut, as if John didn't know how he wanted it cut.
Wow.
But they had, John discovered Joe when Joe was at Synanon. He'd heard about this fantastic guitar player, so he went out to Synanon so that he could meet him, play with him, hang. And Joe always told the story of one of the reasons that John remained so important in his life was because he looked at John and he saw an Italian guitar player, musician, and a family man able to get a home together, have a family, have a career. And he really admired that because, of course, his days before he got clean and sober were quite chaotic and um, really quite something. Actually, I don't know if it's okay to say this or not, but
Sure it is.
It is.
He had some amazing stories about when he was out there and strung out, and they're absolute war stories. I mean, he would say, "I would steal from anybody."
Is this
anything.
John or Joe?
This is Joe.
This
So
is
that's
Joe.
Joe.
Talking about Joe.
John, because John's mother always told him, you can't be a jazz musician because they're all junkies. And of course, John very luckily never succumbed to any of those temptations. He never fell into that trap. But poor Joe struggled with it for a long time. And once he was clean, everything soared for him. And,
Yeah.
So it's really interesting that at that very table that you sat there many, many nights with, with two of the finest guitar players in the world, just having, I'm sure, a glass of wine or two and a meal or three. And I mean, I find that to be there's something holy about that space, if you will. That's how I feel about it. I get kind of like, wow, this is where they did that. This is they. It's kind of nuts. Before we move on to John's story, who's sitting there, because I want to talk about John's playing in a bit. I know that you know a lot about that, but Frank Vignola, who has the guitar night in Birdland in New York City, East Coast, credits John Pisano 100% for what's happening at Birdland in New York. I mean, he makes no bones about it. He'll tell anybody, and loved John. And in fact, he recently told me about we're talking because I talk to Frank fairly often, and he told me about a night when he came or a time when he came out there, and John made him food, pizza, I believe, the famous pizza, and they sat and then they recorded. They made a bunch of recordings, the two of them, just playing tunes. And so then Frank says to me, I wonder if that tape exists. I wonder if I can. He found it. He's
Well,
got it, and we're trying to. He's trying to figure out what to do with it because it is a gem. I've heard it. I actually had it. He sent me a copy, and I want to talk to Frank. I mean, Frank. I told him we were going to do something about this, but it's been a while. I might have to remind him. But maybe we can bring that in because it's the two of them just playing tunes, and it's they just ate, they just had some wine, they did whatever, well, I'm not sure what other alcohol or whatever, and they were really really playing just for each other, and
Wow.
it's beautiful. I mean, it is really, really beautiful. And I know that Frank wants to make sure that it gets its proper respect, if you know what I mean. So I'm just letting you know that that does exist, and I want you to know that Guitar Night in New York City is a hit. It's always perennially sold out. It's a destination now. People, when you go to New York, you got to go to Guitar Night. And I'm not talking about just guitar players. I mean, it's the public in New York City that go there and check it out. And that's 100% inspired by what John did, on the West Coast. I mean, if there was no John Pisano, there'd be no Guitar Night in New York City. You follow what I'm saying? So
Yeah.
it's his legacy is continuing, and his influence is continuing, and all of that, all the love and respect and appreciation for John is alive and well in New York City on a stage. I'm not saying it's not alive and well in all other parts of the world, but I'm just saying in New York City there's a demonstrative, actual example of his influence and the inspiring things that he did right there, still going strong. And if anybody gets a chance to tune into Birdland on Wednesday night, it's also everything's archived on YouTube. You can check it out. It's all free, and he gets some of the world's greatest guitar players in there. I mean, Pasquale Grasso, and I could go on and on with the list. I'll leave people out if I start naming people, but that's
Robert, an amazing legacy you're talking about, and I personally here in Los Angeles watch those all the time.
oh,
I know I'm not alone, but I do want to not let things go by without mentioning, since we're
please,
talking legacy and archives and John's music. One of the things I didn't know until 6 or 8 months ago about John is he was really meticulous, as you've mentioned, but he also had filing cabinets of arrangements and incredible things he wrote, and was very, very sort of studious about it. Almost, I wouldn't say academic because that sounds a little cold, but he really was very highly organized and had an amazing collection, which I'm very happy to say, under the auspices and allowance of Jeanne, that it's been donated to the Los Angeles Jazz Archives, and that's a long-term process where they're going
wow,
to make these things available, which not only include obviously written material, but I have a feeling some spectacular recordings, even on very old formats. They have the gear to be able to go back and reach back into time and make this stuff available. So in the future, something to look forward to is
wow,
this
that's incredible.
I know John, even I think he wouldn't be upset if we said he took a lesson or lessons with Ted Green.
Oh
Even
yeah,
he
no,
recorded that.
he loved Ted Green.
He recorded so many.
Sure.
I mean,
Yeah.
it was stunning when you showed me some of the recordings, and so I think it's going to make people's jaw drop in the future. Just throwing that little bit out there. So that's a very exciting thing, and we have some other exciting stuff. I hope we get to. And now we haven't allowed John to say a piece.
Well, yeah, I was going to say
This is so fun for me to get to hear everybody talk about John. And yeah, John represents the root system of jazz guitar. He is really at the tree trunk of all of us. And I met him in the early 2000s when I came down here to study at SC, and Guitar Night was really in a peak. It had various times and periods where at various venues in town, but Spazio's was a fine dining establishment. People were dressed to the nines. You'd walk in there and there'd be guys like Chuck Niles, who's a very famous radio DJ here in LA for decades. Orchestrators, guys like Kurt Berg, who's a famous copyist in town, did work for John Williams. He would come down there and have a drink and listen to the guitar players. And the first night I was there, not to drop names or anything, but just to share with our jazz guitar audience, just to give you an idea, I remember walking in and I saw at a table Andy Summers, Steve Lukather, and Ted Green all talking about Jimmy Weibel. And I was like, wait a minute, that's the guitarist from Toto. Oh my God, that's the guy from the Police. And I went pale white, and I was there in my USC hoodie and shorts. And our department chair, Richard Smith, was there, and he walked up to me and he said, okay, now that you're in LA, you should go get a blazer. And people wear blazers and jeans to stuff like this. And that was my introduction to LA. And John was so kind. He would have me and the guys at USC sitting in anytime we came. And so another funny story was about in 2012 or 13, when it had moved over to Vitello's for a minute. John was bringing smaller and smaller amps to the gig, so it was easier for him to haul the amp in. And I said, man, I would be honored to haul your amp and set your amp up for you. And he's like, oh, really? Okay, cool. See you next week. I showed up next week, and he had his old Polytone 102 with two ceramic speakers in the back. This amp weighed like 80 pounds. And he said, thanks for hauling my amp for me. This is great. And then he said, I'm kidding. I've got my Razor's Edge that weighs like 6 pounds. Just take that. And that was his.
How did he get that into the trunk of his car is what I want to know.
I remember he's like, I got my Polytone 102. Thanks for setting my amp up. And he had a great sense of humor. And I will say this before we move on, because I know, again, we do want to talk about this unbelievable instrument and Joe too. Right. John represented an era of common sense amongst a lot of musicians that we just don't see this anymore. He was such a great accompanist, and I learned so much about accompanying from John as well. He's a fine soloist, of course, and an amazing jazz guitar player. And everywhere you'd go around the planet, whether you were in the Netherlands or Germany or wherever, people would always say, oh, you're from LA, how's guitar night? Yeah. And John also, he really promoted guitar players, and how great that we all play an instrument like this. And John brought the community together and showed us all how great guitar sounds with guitar. And that is so unique. We don't get that on any other instrument. You don't see drummers having drummer night or piano night or saxophone night. No. And I know I'm going to try really hard in my career, wherever this career takes me. I'm always going to try to do some kind of guitar gig where I play with other guitar players in honor of John, because he showed me so much about the orchestration. I think in the long run, people will think of him like an Andres Segovia on our instrument, to be honest. I think he really is somebody that showed us how great the guitar sounds in a variety of situations. And again, he was so straightforward, and we could all learn to be a little bit more straightforward in this world of tons of academia and jazz. And he just was so good at what he did, and we should all strive to be like that. And I miss. Let me ask you. Every time I pick up the guitar.
Let me ask you a question about John's playing for a minute, and both of you guys can jump in. What was it specifically, as you can? What was it about John's playing that made him so in demand from so many top artists? Why?
We can go down. I'll just say real quick, John's time feel was amazing. When you played with him, the feel was so good, and it was from another world. I'm not kidding.
No. That's probably a good description. I also think he was encyclopedic. I mean, whatever was necessary. If you call him to a session, you're not going to have to do, probably more than one take ever. Variety, you were going down alphabetically of all the recordings and people he worked with, and to have that ability, that diversity at that high a level, is pretty spectacular. But I agree, you're talking about time, space, feel, listening, beautiful voicings moving from one to the next in a very orchestral way, as you talked about. Not, as we're all guitar players, not easy for us. And for him.
It's interesting you say that, because when you can have a guitar player that's worked with Ryan Adams and Sergio Mendes, I mean, I could go on Manhattan Transfer, Barbra Streisand. I mean, all these people, and obviously they loved what he did. I mean, it's is that what you wanted, Mr. Producer? Yes, that's not only what I wanted, but I got another gig next week. You got to be on it, because it's a completely different. I mean, it's pretty tremendous. And what I was saying earlier is that I would agree with you, John, that his sense of rhythm and time was just second to none. It was.
You also have to remember, John was really a part of the wrecking crew of guys in LA with Howard and all those guys. He was on a lot of sessions, and as somebody who's an LA guitar player, and it's so different now, because once you know the producer, they just call you up to do the track in your house. and people get to know you for one thing, so they hire
Right.
you for that, so you get better at that.
Right.
And we've got guys like Andrew Sinwick who are amazing, who would hang at Guitar Night, and he does all the Disney stuff, and he does a variety of guitar sounds. But it's just John came from that era where you were a guitar player and you showed up and did a TVQ and then did this, and
Right.
John loved telling the stories about picking up the checks at the old Union and standing in line with Tommy Johnson, the famous tubaist who was on the Jaws soundtrack. And these guys all knew each other. And it was a small community of musicians. It was maybe 300 musicians in our union at the time.
Yeah.
And loved sharing those stories with the young guitar players. And I'm so honored that he would do that and take that time, because not everybody's super forthcoming and people stick in their generation. And John was always asking about new guitar players. I remember when Gilad Hexelman came to town, he went down to Lucy's to watch him because he was fascinated with his playing. I mean, we should all strive to be like that and to expand, always be listening and learning. And again, it gets me emotional thinking about it. I miss him.
That's such a beautiful point. And also to really support, constantly holding the door open,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
not like, my work is done, I, have this great career, and then you sort of go off to your house and nobody hears from you again. He stayed in the scene, he made a bigger scene, he was so inclusive and I think humble. And that's the thing, you're talking about guitarists and the industry today. It's like we could all go back to study, these iconic players and how they moved in the world and who they were and sort of their attitude, because it's a really important part of it. It's all together.
There's a few people in this planet that their sheer presence commands a respect for wherever they are. In other words, when they walk into a room, it's like, all of a sudden something's happening in this room. And John was that way. I mean, when he showed up, he wasn't loud, he wasn't boisterous, he wasn't, any of those things. But you just knew that somebody important was in the room with you, and you knew that somebody important was, and somebody that mattered. Somebody, I mean, I hate, boy, that's an awful thing to say about human beings, but somebody that really, you understand what I'm saying? That you just somebody that just, wow, I want to know that guy. I want to understand that guy. I want to be in the presence of that guy. I'd like to be that guy's friend. I mean, he just had that commanding presence of, he knew who he was from my point of view, and it was just, wherever he was, it was, the stage that they were on, there was reverence for that stage. When it could be a 10,000 seat hall, or it could be a 25 seat, restaurant. But there's complete reverence for what's going on the stages he was on, because of the power of his energy, of his commitment to the craft. It was important. If he was there, it was important. Something good was going on.
There's this idea of John and younger guitarists and all of that. As you pointed out, he worked with Diana Krall on that really lovely project, the Live in Paris, and with Klaus Augerman arrangements and all of that. And Tommy LaPuma was the one who produced that album, and he called John in on it. And when they did the recording and all of that, and when they took it to Paris, Tommy called him because Anthony Wilson had been playing with Diana Krall. But anyway, for the gig in Paris, this in which they were going to do a live recording on, Tommy calls John and says, "Listen, this kid Anthony," he said, John was playing acoustic guitar because of the Brazilian stuff on this album.
Mm-hmm.
But Anthony was doing the rhythm, but Tommy didn't trust it, and he said, "John," he said, "we're going to Paris." He said, "You need your acoustic guitar. Bring your electric guitar just in case this kid can't." John said to Tommy, he said, "You're really going to make me carry two guitars? I'm telling you, the kid can make it. You don't have to worry. Trust me." And Tommy said, "No, bring your guitar." So we ended up going to Paris with 2 guitars because Tommy wasn't sure about Anthony Wilson.
That's funny.
And of
Wow.
course, it worked out beautifully. And, I mean, Anthony played his behind off, and John always laughed about that. But he was so supportive. I mean, you know, he never for a moment said to Tommy, "Yeah, you're right. He might." It was just the opposite. You got nothing to worry about.
Generosity. That's it right there. Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate it. Bob Bakert for Jazz Guitar Today with Beth Marlis and Jeanne Pisano and John Storie. Thank you, guys. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Okay. Bye bye now.